they cut the efficiency of the financial system or the monetary system in the order of 90% or some such number, that it became almost impossible to clear the market. The goods were there, the supply was there, the demand was there, or even greater, because you had to have reconstruction after the war damage and so on. But there was no mechanism to make the trade, because the multilateral clearing system was not allowed to work. Instead, they had the bilateral. And while in principle it works, and gold is still there to make the exchanges, but what is not there is the efficiency. Because just imagine that all these people in the room are exchanging goods and services, okay, on the multilateral system, which means that you had 90 days to pay the bill. You were billed for either goods or services which you accepted, but you had 90 days to clear, to pay the bill, ultimate extinguishing of that trade credit. I'm asking you, how many gold coins do you need to do that? Because ultimately the maturing bill had to be paid in gold. And whatever number you say is going to be a small number in comparison to, now I'm asking the question for the bilateral thing. Suppose we here in this room all produce goods and consume goods, and there is lots of demand, lots of supply. It's just a matter of exchanging them in an efficient way. But the government did not allow you to use multilateral. You had to use bilateral. The gold coins were still there, but I'm asking you, how many gold coins you need to clear these bilateral trades? And I hope you see my point, that whatever number it is, it will be much, much greater than under the multilateral trade. Because in the multilateral case, the bill itself is a means of payments, a very high-powered means of payment. So many of, and that's called clearing. You don't have to settle. Suppose you are making a pencil and your company just puts this rubber end here, nothing more. Now suppose that step where you get the pencil and you put on this and pass it on to the next guy, suppose that this has to be paid in gold. No clearing, no multilateral bills of exchange can be. You've got to pay it in gold. Now, how much more gold you need if every little piece of work has to be paid in gold? Much, much more. So that is the reason why the British experiment in trying to return to the gold standard failed, because the multilateral means of exchange, the real bill, was removed. The international trade, the Entente powers were in a position to block that international trade of real bills. And they did. And as a result, the demand for gold exploded, and there was just not enough gold, and there's no time to mine so much more. It would have been impossible anyhow. And that's what happened. And that's why the British effort to rehabilitate gold, the gold standard in 1925, was doomed. So this was imposter number one, was it? The Bullion, because there was another thing which the British did in 1925. Very stupid in retrospect. They abolished the wonderful gold coin they had for many, many years, but originally going back to Isaac Newton, who was the warden of the Royal Mint in the Tower at that time, and they withdrew it from circulation. Not allowed. They were demonetized, using a technical word. And they put something extremely clumsy and awkward and very inadequate gold instrument in its place. Could you tell me what it was?
400 ounce bar.
The 400 ounce gold bar, which is 12 and 1/2 kilogram. It's not too big, but very, very heavy. And that was the smallest unit of gold which was supposed to finance world trade. But for some purposes, it filled the bill. But for so many others, it just failed, you know. And that idea was originally formulated by David Ricardo, as I told you already, and it was called the gold bullion standard. It was promoted as a brilliant idea, that it economizes in the efficiency of gold, because you don't have to distribute the gold coins among millions of people. You just make available these 400-ounce gold bars among the top traders, import-export companies, which do make their trades in that order of magnitude, and when they clear at the clearinghouse, it's a proper instrument. I mean, they did these 400-ounce gold bars existed before World War I too, but they were used for a certain limited purpose, and gold coins were used for a much wider circle of trade. And so here we are, imposter number one. The gold bullion standard is the standard which excludes gold coins from circulation, replace them with these gold bars. And it's clumsy, it's inefficient, and you can invent other words to describe this. All right, now I will have to go on because time is flying, and come to the second episode, post-World War episode. Which happened only a few years after the British, and that's the United States. Now, the United States went off the gold standard in March 1933. Roosevelt was elected as the new president in 1932, in November, the usual time of elections. But he did not take office in those days. Nowadays, the new president, the president-elect, takes power in January. But in those days, there was a longer interregnum. The practice was that the president-elect takes the oath of office in March. So Roosevelt took the oath of office in March, and in 3 days' time he issued an order which confiscated the gold of the citizenry. It defaulted on the silver of the gold certificates of the United States. They were no longer exchangeable for gold. Defaulted on all the outstanding debts of the United States, which were gold bonded, and made it a felony for an individual to hold or trade gold. Now, if you ever thought that there was a more thoroughgoing abolishing of the gold standard, then you are mistaken. I mean, they couldn't have done more to abolish it. And all the gold coins were withdrawn and sent to the refinery. They were melted in a huge country like the United States with tremendous amount of trade, collecting all the gold coins from circulation under the law that if you didn't comply, then you had to face the consequences. I think the minimum monetary penalty was something like $20,000 in those gold dollars, and there was jail term also. I forget the details. So that was stamping out the gold standard as thoroughly as you can do it, and that was in violation of the promises which Roosevelt did during the election campaign in 1932, where he used these words: the integrity of the monetary standard has to be preserved at all cost. That was one of the election slogans, and he pilloried his opponent, which was Hoover at the time, President Hoover, the incumbent president, that he made irresponsible statements in the election campaign, with the result that the international standing of the dollar came under a cloud. Well, anyhow, this is just party politics. You can say it's just meaningless, and no knowledgeable people would pay attention to it. But the fact that the gold coins were removed was a fact, and it was executed. Yet, incidentally, the default on gold payments was both domestic and international. And domestic convertibility of the dollar was never reversed, but the international convertibility was. And the surprise is just how soon it was. I'm coming to that in a moment. I'm just pointing out to you that the purpose of the exercise was to take your gold or paper promises to get paid in gold and devalue the dollar in terms of gold, and then where you wanted to reestablish convertibility like the international convertibility of the dollar, you reestablish it but at the new parity, which means stealing that much gold. In the event, it was in the order of 56%. Stolen by the government of the United States from its trading partners all over the world. But domestically, when it came to the citizens of the United States, the rate of robbing people was 100%, because you never got the gold back. You got a paper Federal Reserve note in the event, which said that no gold, but here's the paper. Do what you can with it. And of course, I'm not saying the bread price went up next day, because it didn't. And a lot of other prices didn't go up. But if you happen to be a US citizen living in France at that time, then it was 100% or 56% robbery, because the French prices didn't follow. So there was this effect. All right. My second episode where there was a return to gold, but it turned out to be a failure, is the I'm a little lousy to write it down on the board, so will you please? Thank you very much. The first one you might want to put on is the failure of, or why was Britain's return to the gold standard in 1925 doomed? And underneath in parentheses, imposter gold bullion standard. And now we come to the second episode. Failure of the US to re-establish a proper gold standard in 1934. And underneath in parentheses, imposter gold exchange standard. And, okay, just leave it there. So I'm talking about the second episode. President Roosevelt in 1933 made a second turnaround. The first one was to go back on his campaign promises and abolish the gold standard in the United States in March. But by the end of that year, less than 1 year, he made a complete turnaround, and he went back to the gold standard. On the date of January 1934, he announced a new gold standard. But of course, it did not mean restoration of your gold coins, which were confiscated, or it did not involve the compensation for the default on the gold instruments of the United States. It was just an international reestablishing the gold convertibility of the dollar for the foreign countries, foreign central banks, at the new exchange rate. Now, before the gold standard was abolished in the United States, the exchange rate was, I think, $20.67 in terms of the gold price. So 1 ounce of gold was a little over $20 an ounce. Okay? And by 1934, there was a fluctuating gold price in between the two dates, but by January 1934, the gold price was re-pegged. It was fixed. It was fixed at $35 an ounce. That was the official price which foreign holders of paper dollars could go to the Treasury or to the Federal Reserve banks and get gold for their paper dollars at that exchange rate. And that remained fixed for all the way to 1971. Yeah, so that's about 35 years. There was no change. This was the official price of gold. But please notice that this was a plain highway robbery, because, I mean, the contracts, some of them international and sanctified by several international forums, and called for exchange at the rate of $20, and now you got 35. So this was a devaluation which robbed not just the citizens of the United States, but all the foreign governments. And it was a fraudulent default. Well, default it was, right? Because the original contract was swept aside unilaterally by the government of the United States, and an arbitrary figure, 35, was brought in, and then you could continue business on that basis. But when you, as the debtor, go back and pay some on your debt obligations at a lower rate, and you still have the assets which you were supposed to pay, this is not just a default, but it is a fraudulent default, and there is a very obvious difference between the two. A default because you ran out of money, and sorry, well, what can I do? I mean, if you take my coat for it, I'll be happy to give it to you, but there's not much else I can do. But this wasn't the case at all. The United States still had by far the biggest gold hoard in the world, and they refused to satisfy their creditors at the originally contracted rate. So that is a very shameful chapter in the monetary history of the world, and in particular the monetary history of the United States. How do we... it's 11 o'clock.
It is, so morning tea will be...
Sorry?
Morning tea will be coming in any minute now, so feel free to stop at this point. And
Take a few more minutes.
you can take a few more minutes as well. I don't have to excuse myself.
All right. Now, I won't be able to go through this because the history of failed gold standards is much longer than the time I am allowed. But I tell you what the next one is. We are at 1934. But then, of course, the World War II was already in the making, in the background. And at the end of World War II, towards the end, 1944, this infamous conference, the Bretton Woods Conference. Bretton Woods is a resort area in the United States, the state of New Hampshire. But this is not important. The victorious Allied powers were invited, and they decided the future shape of the monetary relationship in the world. And they came out with what is known, gold exchange standard. Okay. That I should say a word about that. So going back to episode number 2, it's a gold exchange standard because because the U.S. dollar was in a way convertible into gold. So in a way, the U.S. dollar did substitute for gold payments. And therefore, it became very common, or soon after 1934, that trading countries, other than the United States, paid for their imports and collected for their exports, not in gold as before World War I, but in US dollars, because US dollars were indirectly representing gold. And this was bad. Why? Because it involved double counting. The gold was first counted as a reserve against the US dollar. So far, so good. But then, other countries which did not bother keeping a gold reserve at home, they just kept balances, dollar balances, and they considered this as equivalent to gold. So the same gold which the US had was counted again for trading purposes in the world because the dollar was supposed to be backed by gold. That's clear double counting. And if you try to run an insurance company on that principle, you very soon end up in jail, because you can't do that. The insurance company should have certain reserves for various contingencies, and then start saying, okay, we count it again, and we can issue more policies, All right. So now we come to episode 3, and I will just have to cut it very short. In 1944, the Bretton Woods Conference made this a universal principle. The imposter, which is the same, gold exchange. Okay, 3, failure of the gold standard conceived at Bretton Woods in 1944.
Failure of the gold standard.
Gold standard at Bretton Woods in 1944. And you don't have to repeat imposter, but just an arrow will do. Just an arrow going back to, This was the apotheosis of the gold exchange standard. The dollar was made officially, worldwide, the reserve currency of the world. So that was more and more and more double counting of gold. It was a gold standard of sorts, but it was pretty obvious that this is not going to succeed. Now, where is Louis? I have to rely on him for...
Louis had to go. Shall we break now?
Oh, then okay.
We'll
I just sign off, and we continue with the debate after 15
minutes.
Strictly 15
minutes, yeah.
Thank you very much.